3 in the morning. You're alone on a desolate coastline. The only sound breaking the silence is the rhythmic crash of waves against jagged rocks below. Then you see it. A towering lighthouse piercing through the darkness like a skeletal finger pointing toward heaven. But something feels wrong. The light that should be guiding ships to safety flickers erratically. And in that brief moment of illumination, you catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there. A figure standing in the lighthouse window, watching, waiting. Tonight, we journey to 10 of America's most haunted lighthouses where the dead refuse to rest and the living dare not stay after dark. These aren't just stories passed down through generations. These are documented encounters with the supernatural that will make you question everything you thought you knew about death and what lies beyond. But I have to warn you, once you hear these tales, there will be no forgetting them. They will haunt your dreams and make you think twice about every shadow you see dancing in the corner of your eye. Are you ready to discover why lighthouse keepers across America have abandoned their posts and why these towering beacons have become magnets for the restless dead? Let's begin our descent into darkness. Deep in the heart of Maryland, where the Potomac River meets the Chesapeake Bay, stands a lighthouse that has earned the terrifying distinction of being America's most haunted beacon. Point Lookout Lighthouse doesn't just guide ships through treacherous waters. It guards the restless spirits of over 3,000 souls who met their end on these cursed grounds. Built in 1830, this seemingly innocent white structure holds secrets so dark that even seasoned paranormal investigators refuse to spend a full night within its walls. But to understand why Point Lookout has become a supernatural prison, we must first travel back to the blood-soaked 1860s, when this lighthouse witnessed horrors that would make even the bravest souls tremble. During the Civil War, Point Lookout was transformed into something far more sinister than a navigation aid. The federal government established a prisoner of war camp on these grounds, turning 20 acres of Maryland coastland into a living hell for Confederate soldiers. Over 20,000 prisoners were crammed into conditions so deplorable that death became a daily occurrence. But the nightmare didn't end there. The lighthouse itself was converted into a makeshift hospital where wounded soldiers from both sides were brought to either recover or die. The basement became a makeshift morgue where bodies were stacked like cordwood waiting for burial in mass graves scattered across the property. Imagine being a lighthouse keeper during this period. Your job was to maintain the beacon that guided Union supply ships carrying more prisoners to this coastal concentration camp. Every night you would climb those stairs knowing that below you hundreds of men were dying in agony. The screams of the wounded, the moans of the dying, and the whispered prayers of those who had given up hope created a symphony of suffering that seemed to seep into the very foundation of the lighthouse. And Davis, the wife of the first lighthouse keeper, experienced something that would haunt her for eternity. One fog-shrouded evening in 1864, she was climbing the spiral staircase to light the beacon when she heard footsteps behind her. Heavy military boots on wooden steps. She turned expecting to see a Union guard, but found herself staring into the hollow eyes of a Confederate soldier still wearing his tattered gray uniform. The soldier didn't speak. He simply pointed toward the basement where the morgue was located, and followed his gesture and saw something that would drive her to madness. Dozens of spectral figures were walking through the walls wearing nothing but their burial shrouds, their faces twisted in eternal agony. These were the souls of men who had died not in glorious battle but slowly and painfully from disease, starvation, and infected wounds. And screamed, but no sound escaped her lips. The Confederate soldier placed a translucent finger to his mouth in a gesture for silence, then pointed toward the lighthouse lamp. In that moment, and understood. These spirits weren't trying to harm her. They were begging her to keep the light burning so their families would know they had died with honor, not forgotten in some godforsaken prison camp. From that night forward, and Davis began experiencing encounters that would make her question her own sanity. She would wake in the middle of the night to find her bedroom filled with the ghosts of dead soldiers standing at attention as if awaiting orders from beyond the grave. She would smell the putrid odor of rotting flesh wafting up from the basement even though no bodies had been stored there for months. But the most terrifying encounters happened in the lighthouse itself. As Anne climbed the stairs each evening to light the beacon, she would hear conversations echoing from empty rooms. Confederate soldiers discussing battle plans that would never be executed. Union guards complaining about the stench of death that permeated every corner of the compound. And sometimes she would hear something even more disturbing. The sound of men weeping as they wrote final letters to wives and children they would never see again. The psychological toll on Anne was devastating. She began talking to the spirits as if they were old friends. She would set extra places at the dinner table for ghostly visitors who never ate the food she prepared. Her husband, the lighthouse keeper, watched helplessly as his wife slowly descended into madness driven by her nightly encounters with the supernatural residents of Point Lookout. But Anne wasn't the only one experiencing these paranormal encounters. Visitors to the lighthouse reported seeing her spirit long after her death, walking the grounds and tending to wounded men who existed only in the realm between life and death. She had become the eternal caretaker of Point Lookout, a woman whose compassion for the suffering had bound her soul to this place of unimaginable tragedy. 20 years ago, a team of parapsychologists equipped with the most advanced ghost hunting equipment available decided to investigate the claims surrounding Point Lookout Lighthouse. What they discovered during their 3-day investigation would change their understanding of the supernatural forever. The team recorded 24 distinct voices using electronic voice phenomena equipment. These weren't random sounds or static interference. These were clear conversations between spirits who seemed unaware that they had been dead for over a century. Confederate soldiers were discussing battle plans that would never be executed. Union guards were reporting for duty to commanding officers who had turned to dust decades ago. But the most disturbing discovery came when the team explored the basement. The temperature in certain areas dropped so dramatically that their breath became visible in the summer heat. They detected electromagnetic anomalies that made their equipment malfunction in ways they had never experienced. And then they smelled it. The unmistakable odor of human decay so overpowering that several team members had to evacuate the building. One investigator later described the experience as walking through the worst nightmare you could possibly imagine, except knowing that you couldn't wake up from it. He claimed that invisible hands grabbed his shoulders and that he heard whispered pleas for help in languages he didn't recognize. Another team member reported seeing hundreds of faces staring at him from the basement walls, faces of men who had died in agony and whose spirits remained trapped in the location where they had drawn their final breath. The investigation concluded that Point Lookout Lighthouse wasn't just haunted. It was a supernatural prison where the traumatic energy of mass death had created a tear in the fabric between the living world and the realm of the dead. The spirits trapped there weren't malevolent. They were confused souls who didn't understand that their war had ended and their suffering was over. But here's what makes Point Lookout truly terrifying. The hauntings haven't diminished over time. If anything, they have grown stronger. Park rangers who work at Point Lookout State Park report that the paranormal activity increases during the anniversary dates of the worst atrocities committed during the Civil War period. Visitors continue to photograph unexplained figures in the lighthouse windows. And sensitive individuals claim they can still hear the angling cries of dying soldiers carried on the wind during stormy nights. So what makes Point Lookout Lighthouse so different from other haunted locations? The answer lies in the sheer volume of human suffering that occurred here. When thousands of people die in a relatively small area under traumatic circumstances, their collective psychic energy creates what paranormal researchers call a residual haunting. The lighthouse doesn't just contain ghosts. It has become a repository for the most intense emotions experienced by human beings. Fear, pain, desperation, and the overwhelming desire to return home to loved ones. As we prepare to leave Point Lookout behind and journey to our next haunted lighthouse, I want you to remember something. The spirits trapped in these locations were once living, breathing people with hopes, dreams, and families who loved them. Their stories deserve to be told not just as entertainment, but as a reminder of the human cost of conflict and the power of trauma to transcend death itself. But our journey into America's most haunted lighthouses has only just begun. Wait until you hear about the lighthouse where furniture moves by two men and the ghost of a murdered woman seeks revenge on every man who dares to enter her domain. In the ancient city of St. Augustine, Florida, where Spanish conquistadors once walked and pirates counted their stolen treasures, stands a lighthouse that has become synonymous with supernatural terror. The St. Augustine Lighthouse, rising 165 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, is a monument to both human ambition and the price we pay when we disturb the resting places of the dead. Built in 1874, this black and white striped tower replaced an earlier lighthouse that had been claimed by coastal erosion. But the construction of the new lighthouse would unleash a series of tragic events that continue to haunt visitors more than a century later. This is the story of a lighthouse where children play eternal games of hide and seek, where a Spanish painter met his doom, and where the boundary between the living and the dead has been permanently shattered. The horror began before the lighthouse was even completed. During the construction phase, a tramway was built to transport materials from the supply dock to the building site. Local children were fascinated by this mechanical marvel and would often sneak onto the property to ride the tramway cars like it was their personal amusement park. On a humid summer afternoon in 1874, three young girls discovered that one of the tramway cars had been left unattended. Eliza and Mary, the daughters of Superintendent Hezekiah Pitt, along with their friend, whose name has been lost to history, decided to take an unauthorized ride down the tramway toward the water. What should have been an innocent childhood adventure became a tragedy that would echo through eternity. As the car gained momentum racing toward the dock, the girls realized they had no way to stop their makeshift roller coaster. They screamed for help, but their voices were drowned out by the grinding of metal wheels on iron rails. The tramway car shot off the end of the track and plunged into the water, carrying the three children to their deaths in the murky depths of Matanzas Bay. But death was not the end of their story. Within weeks of the accident, workers at the lighthouse construction site began reporting the sound of children's laughter echoing through the unfinished tower. They heard small footsteps running up and down the spiral staircase even though no children were present on the site. Tools would mysteriously disappear and reappear in different locations as if invisible hands were playing pranks on the construction crew. The most disturbing incidents occurred at dusk, when the boundary between day and night created an atmosphere ripe for supernatural manifestations. Workers would catch glimpses of three small figures playing tag around the base of the lighthouse. When they investigated, they would find nothing but small wet footprints leading from the water toward the tower, then mysteriously vanishing at the lighthouse entrance. One construction foreman later described an encounter that haunted him for the rest of his life. He was working alone in the lighthouse after hours when he heard what sounded like children giggling above him. Assuming that local kids had somehow gotten past security, he climbed the spiral staircase to investigate. As he ascended, the sound of laughter grew louder and more distinct. But when he reached the top of the lighthouse, he found himself completely alone. As he prepared to descend, he heard something that made his blood freeze in his veins. Three young voices singing a nursery rhyme in perfect harmony. But these weren't the voices of living children. There was an otherworldly quality to the sound, as if it was coming from somewhere beyond the physical realm. The foreman later swore that he could see his breath in the summer heat and that the temperature around him had dropped at least 20 degrees. But the tragic deaths of the three girls were only the beginning of the supernatural activity that would plague the St. Augustine Lighthouse. During the construction of the original Spanish lighthouse in the 1600s, a painter named Andrew was hired to apply the finishing touches to the tower's exterior. This was considered a prestigious assignment, and Andrew took great pride in his meticulous craftsmanship. Working at such heights required courage and skill that few men possessed. Andrew would suspend himself from ropes and pulleys, spending hours at a time painting the lighthouse while ocean winds threatened to tear him from his precarious perch. But his dedication to his craft would ultimately cost him his life in the most horrific way imaginable. On what should have been his final day of work, Andrew was applying the last strokes of paint to the lighthouse when a sudden gust of wind caught his scaffold. He struggled to maintain his balance, but the wooden platform tilted at a dangerous angle. Andrew reached for his safety rope, but the line had somehow become tangled around his legs. As he fell toward the rocky ground below, he realized that instead of saving his life, the rope would be the instrument of his death. Witnesses described hearing Andreas' terrified screams echoing across the construction site as he plummeted toward earth. But instead of the merciful quick death that a fall from such height should have provided, the safety rope caught around his neck, snapping taut just feet from the ground. Andrew died not from the impact but from strangulation, dangling like a gruesome pendulum from the very lighthouse he had spent weeks beautifying. The traumatic nature of Andreas' death seemed to bind his spirit to the lighthouse in ways that defied rational explanation. Almost immediately after his burial, strange incidents began occurring during the night shift. Workers would arrive in the morning to find paintbrushes arranged in perfect geometric patterns on surfaces that had been cleaned the evening before. Buckets of paint would be found knocked over, but instead of creating random splatters, the spilled paint would form deliberate designs that resembled Spanish religious symbols. But the most terrifying encounters with Andreas' spirit happened to anyone who attempted to work on the exterior of the lighthouse. Multiple painters over the years reported feeling invisible hands pushing them toward the edge of scaffolding. They would hear whispered warnings in Spanish echoing around them even when no other workers were present. Some claimed to see a translucent figure of a man in period clothing standing on the lighthouse balcony, pointing toward areas that needed touch-up work. One painter in the 1930s had an encounter with Andreas' ghost that was so traumatic he never worked at heights again. He was suspended from the lighthouse applying a fresh coat of paint when he noticed that someone was painting alongside him. At first he assumed it was another worker, but when he turned to introduce himself, he found himself staring into the hollow eyes of a man wearing clothes from 3 centuries earlier. The ghostly painter was mimicking every brushstroke with supernatural precision, but his paintbrush left no marks on the lighthouse surface. Instead, he seemed to be painting in the air itself, creating invisible masterpieces that existed only in the realm of the dead. The living painter watched in fascination and horror as the spirit worked with the same meticulous attention to detail that had defined his life. But then the ghost turned toward the living man and spoke in accented English that carried the weight of centuries. He warned that the lighthouse belonged to those who had died in its service, and that the living were merely temporary caretakers of a monument to the dead. The spirit explained that he continued his work because his artistic soul could not rest while imperfections remained on the structure he had died to complete. The encounter lasted only minutes, but its impact on the witness was profound. He descended from the lighthouse in a state of shock and never returned to finish the job. Years later, he would tell anyone who would listen that working on the St. Augustine Lighthouse meant sharing the workspace with craftsmen who had been dead for generations, but who remained dedicated to their eternal assignments. Current employees of the St. Augustine Lighthouse Museum continue to report paranormal encounters that follow the same patterns established over a century ago. The spirits of the 3 drowned girls are still heard playing in the lighthouse after closing hours. Security cameras have captured unexplained orbs of light moving through the tower in patterns that suggest intelligent control rather than random atmospheric phenomena. Visitors on ghost tours regularly photograph mysterious figures in the lighthouse windows, figures that were not visible to the naked eye when the pictures were taken. Some photographs show what appears to be a man in work clothes standing at the top of the lighthouse holding painting supplies that disappeared decades ago. Others capture the translucent forms of children running up and down the spiral staircase, their faces frozen in expressions of eternal joy despite their tragic fate. But perhaps most disturbing are the reports from visitors who claim to experience sudden overwhelming feelings of sadness and loss while climbing the lighthouse stairs. They describe being overcome by emotions that don't belong to them, as if they are experiencing the final moments of people who died in the lighthouse years before they were born. The electromagnetic anomalies detected throughout the lighthouse suggest that the building itself has become a conductor for supernatural energy. Electronic devices malfunction in specific areas where tragic deaths occurred. Temperatures fluctuate wildly without any identifiable source. And sensitive individuals report feeling watched by invisible presences that seem to follow them throughout their visit. What makes the St. Augustine Lighthouse particularly unsettling is the way the spirits interact with the living world. Unlike many haunted locations where ghosts appear to be trapped in repetitive patterns, these spirits seem aware of current events and react to the presence of visitors. The children continue to play their games, but they adapt their activities to include modern elements they observe in the Lighthouse Museum. Andrew continues his painting, but he appears to critique the work of contemporary maintenance crews who care for his beloved lighthouse. This suggests that the St. Augustine Lighthouse isn't just haunted by residual energy from past tragedies. It has become home to conscious spirits who have chosen to remain in the physical world rather than move on to whatever lies beyond death. They have transformed the lighthouse into their eternal residence where the distinction between past and present has become meaningless. As we prepare to leave St. Augustine and travel to our next haunted destination, remember that lighthouses were built to guide travelers safely to shore. But sometimes the very structures meant to provide safety become prisons for souls who can never find their way home. And speaking of prisons, wait until you discover the lighthouse where a woman's vengeful spirit terrorizes every man who dares to enter her domain. 12 miles off the coast of Rhode Island, where the Atlantic Ocean batters weathered cliffs with relentless fury, stands one of New England's most architecturally stunning lighthouses. The Block Island Southeast Light, with its distinctive red brick Victorian Gothic design, should be a testament to 19th-century engineering prowess. Instead, it has become a monument to domestic violence and supernatural revenge that continues to claim victims more than a century after the original crime was committed. Built in 1875 and designated as a National Historic Landmark, this lighthouse was considered one of the finest examples of lighthouse construction by the United States Lighthouse Board. But within its beautiful walls, a horror unfolded that transformed a beacon of safety into a trap for the living and a fortress for the dead. The story begins with Thomas Eldridge, the lighthouse's second keeper, who assumed his duties in 1882. By all accounts, Thomas was a competent lighthouse keeper who maintained the beacon with precision and dedication. But behind the facade of professional competence lurked a man whose capacity for violence would shock even the most jaded observers of human nature. Thomas had married young to a woman named Sarah, who shared his dream of lighthouse keeping as a romantic adventure. She imagined long walks along the cliff overlooking the ocean, cozy evenings reading by lamplight, and the satisfaction of knowing their work saved lives by guiding ships safely to harbor. But Sarah had not anticipated the isolation that came with lighthouse duty, or the way that isolation would bring out the worst aspects of her husband's personality. Block Island in the 1880s was not the tourist destination it would later become. During winter months, the lighthouse could be cut off from the mainland for weeks at a time. Supply boats couldn't navigate the treacherous waters during storms, and communication with the outside world was limited to signal flags and occasional visits from lighthouse inspectors. For Sarah, this isolation became a prison sentence she had never agreed to serve. She watched her husband transform from a loving partner into a controlling tyrant who monitored her every movement and flew into violent rages over imagined slights. Thomas began accusing Sarah of having affairs with supply boat captains, lighthouse inspectors, and even the occasional shipwreck survivors they rescued from the churning waters below. The accusations were absurd given their isolation, but logic had no place in Thomas Eldridge's increasingly paranoid mind. He began restricting Sarah's access to the lighthouse itself, claiming that her presence distracted him from his duties. She was forbidden from climbing to the light room, prohibited from greeting visitors, and eventually confined to the ground floor living quarters like a prisoner in her own home. But confinement was only the beginning of Sarah's ordeal. Thomas' physical abuse escalated with each passing month. He would strike her for speaking too loudly, for preparing meals that didn't meet his exacting standards, and for showing any sign of unhappiness with their situation. Sarah learned to move through the lighthouse like a ghost, trying to remain invisible to avoid triggering her husband's explosive temper. The psychological torture was even worse than the physical abuse. Thomas would describe in graphic detail what he claimed were Sarah's infidelities with men she had never met. He would force her to confess to imaginary sins and beg forgiveness for crimes that existed only in his diseased mind. When lighthouse inspectors visited, Thomas would present himself as the perfect gentleman while ensuring that Sarah was too frightened to reveal the truth about her situation. For 3 years, Sarah endured this nightmare, hoping that Thomas would eventually come to his senses or that someone would recognize her plight and intervene. But help never came, and Thomas' behavior continued to deteriorate. He began staying awake for days at a time, convinced that Sarah was plotting against him. He would patrol the lighthouse at all hours, checking and rechecking locks, muttering accusations under his breath. The end came on a fog-shrouded night in November 1885. A merchant vessel had foundered on the rocks below the lighthouse, and Thomas was working frantically to signal other ships away from the dangerous coast. Sarah, seeing an opportunity to help, tried to assist by preparing hot food and blankets for any survivors who might be rescued. But Thomas interpreted her humanitarian gesture as evidence of her infidelity. In his twisted logic, Sarah was preparing to welcome her lovers who had arranged the shipwreck as a cover for their secret rendezvous. When she tried to explain that she was simply trying to help save lives, Thomas flew into the most violent rage of their marriage. Witnesses from the rescue boats later testified that they heard screaming coming from the lighthouse, even over the sound of crashing waves and howling wind. They saw shadows moving frantically behind the lighthouse windows and observed what appeared to be a struggle taking place in the light room itself. But they were too focused on saving drowning sailors to investigate the domestic drama unfolding in the lighthouse above them. Thomas dragged Sarah to the top of the lighthouse, accusing her of signaling to her imaginary lovers with the beacon itself. He claimed that she had been using the lighthouse equipment to arrange secret meetings, and that the shipwreck was part of an elaborate conspiracy against him. Sarah pleaded for her life, swearing that she had never been unfaithful and begging Thomas to remember the man he had been when they first married. But Thomas was beyond reason. In a final act of rage, he pushed Sarah from the lighthouse balcony, sending her plummeting to the rocky ground below. Her screams were lost in the wind, and her broken body was not discovered until the following morning, when the rescue operations had concluded and investigators came to question the lighthouse keeper about the previous night's events. Thomas claimed that Sarah had committed suicide, overcome by guilt over her supposed infidelities. He produced a farewell note that he claimed to have found in their bedroom, a document that investigators later determined had been written in Thomas' handwriting rather than Sarah's. But without witnesses to contradict his story, and with no way to prove murder in an era before modern forensic techniques, Thomas was never charged with his wife's death. The official cause of death was listed as accidental fall, but everyone who knew the couple understood that Sarah Eldridge had been murdered by the man who had sworn to love and protect her. Thomas continued as lighthouse keeper for another 6 months before requesting a transfer to a mainland facility. He claimed that the isolation of Block Island was affecting his mental health, but those who knew the truth understood that he was fleeing from something far more terrifying than loneliness. Because Sarah Eldridge did not rest quietly in her grave. Within days of her burial, strange incidents began occurring at the southeast light. The lighthouse beacon would flicker in patterns that seemed to spell out messages in Morse code. When decoded, these messages contained accusations of murder and demands for justice that would never come through earthly courts. But Sarah's supernatural revenge was not limited to electronic manipulation. She began appearing to visitors with a terrible purpose that reflected her own tragic experience with male violence. Men who toured the lighthouse or worked on maintenance projects reported being shaken awake in the middle of the night by invisible hands. They would find their beds lifted and tilted as if someone was trying to dump them onto the floor. Male visitors staying overnight in the lighthouse have reported being locked out of their rooms by doors that have no automatic locking mechanisms. They would hear women's voices whispering accusations through the walls, voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Some claimed to see a woman in Victorian dress standing at the lighthouse windows, pointing accusatory fingers at them and mouthing words they could not hear but somehow understood. The most terrifying encounters involved physical attacks that left no visible injuries but caused lasting psychological trauma. Men reported being pushed downstairs by invisible forces, shoved against walls by hands they could not see, and having heavy objects hurled at them by a presence that seemed to move through the lighthouse with supernatural speed and strength. One maintenance worker in the 1960s had an encounter with Sarah's spirit that exemplified her supernatural mission of revenge. He was working alone in the lighthouse replacing damaged window panes when he heard footsteps approaching from behind. Assuming it was another worker, he turned to greet his colleague, but found himself face to face with a woman whose eyes burned with otherworldly fury. Sarah Eldridge's ghost spoke to him in a voice that carried the accumulated rage of decades spent seeking justice. She told him that men could not be trusted with power over women, and that anyone who entered her lighthouse was subject to the same judgment her husband had escaped in life. The worker tried to explain that he was just doing his job, but Sarah was beyond reason, just as her husband had been beyond reason on the night he murdered her. The ghost began throwing tools around the room with supernatural force, creating a whirlwind of flying objects that drove the worker toward the lighthouse stairs. As he fled, he could hear Sarah's voice following him, demanding that he confess to whatever crimes against women he had committed in his lifetime. The worker later swore that he felt invisible hands trying to push him down the stairs, just as Sarah herself had been pushed to her death. But Sarah's revenge is not limited to random violence. Investigators have discovered that her attacks follow a pattern that suggests supernatural intelligence and moral purpose. Men with histories of domestic violence or sexual assault report the most intense encounters with her spirit. She seems to possess an otherworldly ability to detect guilt and respond with proportional supernatural punishment. Conversely, women visitors to the lighthouse report entirely different experiences with Sarah's ghost. They describe feeling protected and welcomed by a maternal presence that seems to watch over them during their visit. Some have reported seeing a woman in Victorian dress who nods approvingly at them or leaves small gifts like flowers or vintage jewelry in their rooms. Female lighthouse keepers and tour guides claim that Sarah actively assists them in their work. Equipment that malfunctions for male employees works perfectly for women. Doors that jam shut for men open easily for female staff members. And during dangerous storms, several women have reported hearing a voice warning them of hazardous conditions before weather monitoring equipment detected the approaching danger. This gender-specific haunting pattern suggests that Sarah Eldridge's ghost retains the memories and motivations that defined her tragic life. She continues to fear and distrust men while seeking to protect other women from the kind of abuse she suffered. Her supernatural mission is not random haunting but focused revenge against a gender that failed to protect her when she was alive. Modern paranormal investigators equipped with electronic voice phenomena equipment have recorded dozens of messages from Sarah's spirit. These recordings reveal a consciousness that remains fixated on the injustices of her life and death. She speaks of waiting for Thomas to return so she can confront him with evidence of his crimes. She asks about changes in laws that might protect women from domestic violence. And she warns living women about men in their lives who remind her of her murderous husband. The Southeast Light represents a unique form of supernatural justice where the victim has become the judge, jury, and executioner. Sarah's ghost has transformed the lighthouse into a courtroom where men are tried for the collective crimes of their gender. Those found guilty face supernatural punishment while those deemed innocent are allowed to leave unharmed. But what makes this haunting truly terrifying is its moral complexity. Sarah Eldridge was genuinely victimized by a system that failed to protect her from domestic violence. Her supernatural revenge can be understood as a quest for justice that was denied to her in life. Yet her methods involve terrorizing innocent men who had nothing to do with her murder, creating new victims in her pursuit of cosmic balance. As we prepare to leave Block Island and journey to our next haunted lighthouse, consider this unsettling question. When earthly justice fails and the legal system cannot protect the innocent, do the dead have the right to impose their own supernatural judgment on the living? And what happens when a spirit dedicated to justice becomes indistinguishable from a force of supernatural terror? But our exploration of America's most haunted lighthouses continues, and our next destination will challenge everything you think you know about the relationship between the living and the dead. Wait until you discover the lighthouse where three distinct spirits share the same space and continue to perform the duties they carried out in life. On the rugged coast of Northern California, where the Pacific Ocean meets the towering redwood forests, stands a lighthouse that defies the natural order of life and death. Battery Point Lighthouse in Crescent City represents one of the most unusual haunted locations in America because its supernatural residents have never stopped working. Three spirits continue to maintain their eternal vigil, protecting ships from the treacherous waters that have claimed hundreds of vessels over the past century and a half. Built in 1856, Battery Point Lighthouse is unique among West Coast beacons for its accessibility during low tide and complete isolation during high tide. This tidal island lighthouse can be reached on foot when the ocean recedes but becomes completely surrounded by churning waters when the tide returns. This isolation created perfect conditions for the intense bonds between lighthouse keepers that would transcend death itself. The lighthouse served faithfully until 1965, when the Coast Guard decommissioned it in favor of automated navigation systems. But decommissioning a lighthouse and retiring its ghostly keepers proved to be two entirely different challenges. The spirits who had dedicated their lives to guiding ships safely to shore were not ready to abandon their posts just because the government had declared their services obsolete. The story of Battery Point supernatural residents begins with Jeremiah Matthews, who served as head keeper from 1878 until his death in 1903. Jeremiah was a dedicated lighthouse keeper who took pride in maintaining the beacon with meticulous precision. He treated the lighthouse like a sacred trust, understanding that the difference between life and death for countless sailors depended on his vigilance and skill. But Jeremiah was not alone in his commitment to lighthouse keeping. His assistant keeper, Marcus Webb, shared the same dedication to their life-saving mission. Marcus had joined the lighthouse service after losing his brother in a shipwreck that might have been prevented if a lighthouse beacon had been properly maintained. He viewed his work as both profession and personal crusade against the ocean that had claimed so many lives. The third member of this supernatural trio was Emma Patterson, the lighthouse keeper's housekeeper, who managed the domestic aspects of lighthouse life. Emma's role was crucial because lighthouse keeping required someone to maintain the living quarters, prepare meals, and provide medical care when injuries occurred during the dangerous work of beacon maintenance. These three individuals formed a tight-knit community bound together by their shared isolation and common purpose. They worked together for over 2 decades, creating routines and relationships that became as essential to their identities as breathing itself. When death finally claimed them, they discovered that their bonds were stronger than the grave and their sense of duty more powerful than the transition from life to whatever lies beyond. Jeremiah Matthews died first, succumbing to pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter when supply boats could not reach the lighthouse for weeks. Marcus and Emma cared for him during his final illness, but medical care in 1903 was primitive, especially in remote lighthouse locations. Jeremiah died in the lighthouse bedroom overlooking the ocean he had served for 25 years. But death did not end Jeremiah's commitment to lighthouse keeping. Within days of his burial, Marcus and Emma began experiencing encounters that suggested their friend and supervisor had not truly departed. They would hear familiar footsteps climbing the spiral staircase to the light room at the exact times Jeremiah had made his nightly rounds. The lighthouse beacon would be lit and extinguished according to Jeremiah's personal schedule, even when Marcus had not performed those duties. Marcus initially dismissed these incidents as grief-induced hallucinations, but the evidence of Jeremiah's continued presence became impossible to ignore. Tools would be arranged in the precise patterns Jeremiah had preferred. The lighthouse logbook would contain entries written in handwriting that matched Jeremiah's style but appeared overnight when no living person had access to the building. Emma, who was more sensitive to supernatural phenomena, began seeing Jeremiah's translucent figure performing his usual duties throughout the lighthouse. She would observe him checking the beacon lens, polishing brass fixtures, and inspecting the building's exterior just as he had done when alive. The ghost seemed unaware that he had died and continued following the same routines that had defined his earthly existence. Rather than being frightened by Jeremiah's supernatural presence, Marcus and Emma found comfort in knowing their friend remained with them. They began talking to his spirit as if he were still alive, updating him on lighthouse maintenance issues and seeking his advice on technical problems. Jeremiah's ghost would respond by manipulating physical objects to indicate approval or disapproval of their decisions. This unusual relationship between the living and the dead continued for 7 more years until Marcus Webb died of a heart attack while climbing the lighthouse stairs in 1910. Emma found his body the following morning and realized that she was now alone with 2 ghosts in one of America's most isolated lighthouse locations. But Marcus' death did not increase Emma's isolation. Instead, it completed a supernatural triangle that would define Battery Point Lighthouse for the next century. Marcus' spirit joined Jeremiah's in performing eternal lighthouse duties, creating a tag team of ghostly keepers who shared responsibilities just as they had in life. Emma discovered that she could communicate with both spirits through a system of knocking sounds and object manipulation that resembled a supernatural form of Morse code. The ghosts would indicate their presence by moving specific items, rearranging furniture, and creating temperature changes in different areas of the lighthouse. Emma learned to interpret these signals and began serving as a liaison between the supernatural lighthouse keepers and the living world. When Emma herself died in 1918 of influenza during the global pandemic that claimed millions of lives, she joined her friends in their eternal lighthouse duties. But unlike Jeremiah and Marcus, who seemed unaware of their deaths, Emma retained full consciousness of her supernatural state. She became the spokesperson for the ghostly lighthouse keeping team, using her ability to appear visibly to living visitors to explain their continued presence at Battery Point. Current caretakers of Battery Point Lighthouse report regular encounters with all 3 spirits who continue performing their assigned duties with the same dedication they showed in life. Jeremiah maintains the beacon and monitors weather conditions. Marcus handles the mechanical aspects of lighthouse operation and building maintenance. Emma manages domestic affairs and serves as hostess to visitors who come to learn about lighthouse history. But these are not passive ghosts trapped in repetitive patterns from their earthly lives. The Battery Point spirits adapt to modern conditions and incorporate new technology into their eternal routines. They have learned to operate electric lighting systems, work with modern weather monitoring equipment, and even interact with digital cameras and recording devices used by paranormal investigators. Visitors to Battery Point Lighthouse regularly photograph unexplained figures in keeper uniforms tending to duties throughout the building. Security cameras have recorded all 3 spirits working together to move heavy equipment and perform maintenance tasks that would be difficult for living people to accomplish. Electronic voice phenomena recordings capture conversations between the ghostly keepers as they coordinate their supernatural duties. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Battery Point haunting is the way the spirits interact with living caretakers and volunteers who help maintain the lighthouse as a historical site. Rather than frightening these individuals, the ghosts seem to welcome their assistance, and provide guidance based on more than a century of accumulated lighthouse keeping experience. Volunteer caretakers report that tools appear exactly where they need them during maintenance projects. Weather warnings seem to come from supernatural sources that predict dangerous conditions before modern meteorological equipment detects approaching storms. And when serious problems arise, the ghostly lighthouse keepers somehow summon help by activating communication equipment or creating visual signals that attract attention from the mainland. The relationship between living and dead at Battery Point Lighthouse represents a unique form of supernatural cooperation that benefits everyone involved. The spirits get to continue the work that gave their lives meaning, while living caretakers receive guidance from the most experienced lighthouse keepers in American history. This arrangement has created a harmonious haunting where the supernatural presence enhances rather than threatens the lighthouse mission. But perhaps most remarkable is the way the Battery Point spirits have maintained their individual personalities and relationships despite being dead for over a century. Paranormal investigators have observed interactions between the three ghosts that reflect the same dynamics they shared in life. Jeremiah remains the authoritative supervisor, Marcus continues to focus on technical details, and Emma serves as the social coordinator who keeps the team functioning smoothly. Visitors sensitive to paranormal activity report feeling welcomed by the Battery Point spirits who seem eager to share their knowledge and experiences with anyone genuinely interested in lighthouse history. The ghosts appear to take pride in their lighthouse and enjoy showing it off to appreciative visitors. They have been known to pose for photographs, point out interesting architectural features, and even demonstrate historical lighthouse keeping techniques. This cooperative relationship between the living and the dead at Battery Point Lighthouse suggests that death does not necessarily end human relationships or professional commitments. The three spirits have created a supernatural community where their earthly bonds continue to provide meaning and purpose long after their physical lives ended. Modern lighthouse historians consider Battery Point one of the best preserved examples of 19th-century lighthouse operations, partially because the ghostly keepers have continued maintaining the facility according to historical standards. The supernatural lighthouse keepers serve as guardians of both the physical structure and the traditional knowledge that defined American lighthouse keeping during its golden age. The Battery Point spirits also demonstrate that hauntings can be positive forces that preserve history and honor human dedication rather than terrorizing the living. Their continued presence transforms the lighthouse from a simple historical artifact into a living museum where visitors can experience authentic lighthouse keeping through interaction with practitioners who never truly retired from their calling. As we prepare to leave Battery Point Lighthouse and continue our journey through America's most haunted beacons, remember that not all ghosts are tormented souls seeking release from earthly bonds. Some spirits choose to remain in the physical world because they have found work that gives their existence meaning and relationships that make eternity worthwhile. But our exploration of supernatural lighthouse keepers is far from over. Our next destination will introduce you to a ghost whose dedication to his craft has driven him to madness, and whose obsessive perfectionism continues to terrorize anyone who dares to disturb his eternal work. 20 miles off the coast of Maine, where the Atlantic Ocean stretches endlessly toward the horizon, stands a lighthouse that has become synonymous with isolation madness and the terrible price of obsessive love. Seguin Island Light, built in 1795, is more than just a navigation aid. It has become a monument to the destructive power of monotony and the way repeated exposure to the same stimulus can drive even the most rational mind into the darkest corners of insanity. The lighthouse itself rises 53 feet above Seguin Island, a rocky outcrop that measures less than 64 acres and supports virtually no vegetation beyond hardy grasses that somehow survive the constant assault of salt spray and ocean winds. During winter months, the island becomes completely isolated from the mainland as ice and storms make boat travel impossible for weeks at a time. This isolation created perfect conditions for the tragedy that would forever define Seguin Island Light as one of America's most psychologically disturbing haunted locations. The horror began in the early 1800s when a newly appointed lighthouse keeper brought his young wife to live on Seguin Island. The keeper, whose name has been lost to history, was dedicated to his duties and looked forward to a quiet life tending the beacon with his beloved bride by his side. His wife, whose identity remains unknown, was an accomplished pianist who had studied music in Boston before her marriage. She viewed the lighthouse assignment as a romantic adventure where she could practice her music without disturbing neighbors while supporting her husband's important work saving lives at sea. To make their isolated home more civilized, she arranged to have a piano transported to Seguin Island despite the enormous difficulty and expense of moving such a large instrument to such a remote location. The piano arrived during the summer of 1805, carried to the island by a supply boat and hauled up the rocky shore by a team of men who understood they were participating in something unprecedented. No lighthouse in America's history had ever been equipped with such a luxury item. The wife was overjoyed to have her beloved instrument in their new home and spent hours each day practicing pieces she had learned during her musical education. But the wife's limited repertoire would prove to be the seed of a tragedy that continues to haunt Seguin Island more than 2 centuries later. She had mastered only one complete musical composition, a melancholy ballad that reflected her growing loneliness and isolation on the windswept island. Day after day, she played the same piece over and over again, finding comfort in the familiar melody that connected her to her previous life on the mainland. At first, the lighthouse keeper enjoyed listening to his wife's piano playing. The music provided a civilized counterpoint to the harsh environment of lighthouse keeping and reminded him of the cultural refinements they had left behind in their former home. But as weeks turned to months and months turned to years, the constant repetition of the same musical piece began to wear on his nerves in ways he had never anticipated. The lighthouse keeper tried to be patient with his wife, understanding that she was coping with isolation in the only way she knew how. He suggested that she learn new pieces from sheet music they could order from the mainland, but she explained that the familiar melody was the only thing that kept her sane during the long dark winters when storms raged for days at a time. But patience has limits even in the most loving marriages, and the lighthouse keeper's tolerance for his wife's musical obsession began to deteriorate. The same melody that had once seemed beautiful now sounded like a funeral dirge that echoed through the lighthouse at all hours of the day and night. He would wake to the sound of piano music drifting up from the living quarters and fall asleep to the same haunting melody that seemed to penetrate every corner of their island prison. The psychological impact of hearing the same piece of music hundreds of times created a form of auditory torture that drove the lighthouse keeper toward madness. He began having nightmares where the melody played endlessly in his dreams, preventing him from achieving restful sleep. During his waking hours, he would catch himself humming the tune unconsciously, only to realize that the music had become so embedded in his consciousness that he could not escape it even when his wife was not playing. The lighthouse keeper tried various strategies to cope with his growing musical torment. He stuffed cotton in his ears while working but could still hear the muffled sound of piano music echoing through the lighthouse structure. He asked his wife to limit her playing to specific hours, but she explained that music was her only source of emotional release and that restricting her piano time would be equivalent to condemning her to complete despair. As the months passed, the lighthouse keeper began to associate the piano music with everything wrong in his life. The melody became a symbol of his isolation, his failed dreams, and his growing resentment toward his wife, who seemed oblivious to the psychological torture she was inflicting on him. What had begun as love slowly transformed into hatred focused on the piano that had become the instrument of his mental destruction. The inevitable confrontation came during a fierce winter storm that had trapped the couple on Seguin Island for over a month without any contact with the outside world. The lighthouse keeper had been working for days without adequate sleep, trying to maintain the beacon during dangerous conditions, while the constant sound of piano music undermined his ability to concentrate on his life-saving duties. When his wife began playing her usual melody for what seemed like the 100th time that day, something snapped in the lighthouse keeper's mind. Years of accumulated frustration and resentment exploded into a rage that consumed every rational thought in his consciousness. He stormed into their living quarters and confronted his wife about her musical obsession, demanding that she stop playing immediately. But his wife could not understand why her husband was so upset about something that brought her comfort and joy. She tried to explain that the music was essential to her mental health and that asking her to give up her piano would be like asking her to give up breathing. The lighthouse keeper, however, was beyond rational discussion. He had reached a psychological breaking point where compromise was impossible and violence seemed like the only solution. What happened next varies depending on which version of the story you hear, but all accounts agree that the lighthouse keeper attacked his wife in a fit of madness driven by years of musical torture. Some versions claim he strangled her with piano wire in a grotesque irony that transformed her beloved instrument into the weapon of her destruction. Others suggest he beat her to death with a fireplace poker while she tried to protect her precious piano from his rage. But the most disturbing version of the story claims that the lighthouse keeper forced his wife to continue playing her melody while he slowly killed her, ensuring that her final moments on Earth were accompanied by the same music that had driven him insane. According to this account, her dying screams harmonized with the piano melody, creating a symphony of horror that echoed through the lighthouse as her life ebbed away. After murdering his wife, the lighthouse keeper faced the reality of what he had done and the prospect of spending the rest of his life alone on Seguin Island with only the memory of his crime for company. Unable to cope with his guilt and the isolation that had originally driven him to violence, he decided to join his wife in death. He hanged himself from the lighthouse rafters, leaving behind a scene of domestic horror that would traumatize everyone who later discovered the bodies. But death did not end the musical torment that had defined the final years of the lighthouse keeper's life. Within days of the double funeral, strange reports began coming from Seguin Island. Passing ships reported hearing piano music drifting across the water, even though no living person remained on the island. Supply boats approaching the lighthouse detected the same melancholy melody that had driven the lighthouse keeper to murder and suicide. When new lighthouse keepers were assigned to Seguin Island, they discovered that the piano had survived the tragedy and continued to produce music without human intervention. The keys would depress by themselves, playing the same piece over and over again, as if invisible hands were performing the eternal concert that had cost two people their lives. Subsequent lighthouse keepers tried various methods to stop the supernatural piano performances. They locked the piano keyboard, but the music continued to emanate from the instrument. They moved the piano to different rooms, but the ghostly performances followed wherever the instrument was relocated. Some keepers tried to have the piano removed from the island entirely, but supply boats would develop mechanical problems whenever they attempted to transport the cursed instrument away from Seguin Island. The most desperate lighthouse keepers resorted to destroying the piano with axes and hammers, but even this extreme measure failed to silence the supernatural music. The broken piano would somehow repair itself overnight and resume its ghostly performances as if nothing had happened. The melody seemed to exist independently of the physical instrument, using the piano as a conduit for supernatural expression that transcended the normal laws of physics. Modern visitors to Seguin Island Light continue to report hearing piano music, even though no piano currently exists in the lighthouse. The melody has become embedded in the island's supernatural landscape and can be detected by sensitive individuals who visit the location where musical obsession led to murder and madness. Paranormal investigators have recorded electronic voice phenomena that capture not only the ghostly piano music but also conversations between the murdered wife and her killer. These recordings suggest that both spirits remain trapped on Seguin Island, locked in an eternal argument about the piano music that destroyed their marriage and cost them their lives. The lighthouse keeper's ghost continues to demand that his wife stop playing, while her spirit insists that music is the only thing that makes their supernatural existence bearable. They appear to be reliving the same conflict that led to their deaths, unable to find resolution or peace even in the afterlife. But perhaps most disturbing are reports from visitors who experienced the same psychological deterioration that drove the original lighthouse keeper to violence. People who spend extended time on Seguin Island describe becoming obsessed with the ghostly piano melody that seems to burrow into their consciousness and remain there long after they leave the island. Some visitors report hearing the melody in their dreams for months after visiting Seguin Island. Others claim that the music follows them home and can be heard playing softly in their houses during quiet moments. A few individuals have sought psychiatric treatment for what they describe as musical haunting that interferes with their ability to concentrate and sleep. The Seguin Island Light represents one of the most psychologically complex hauntings in American history because it demonstrates how supernatural activity can replicate and amplify the mental illness that originally created the ghostly presence. The spirits trapped on the island continue to experience the same obsessions and conflicts that define their earthly existence, creating a feedback loop of madness that affects both the dead and the living. As we prepare to leave Seguin Island and its tortured spirits behind, consider this disturbing question. If exposure to supernatural phenomena can trigger the same mental deterioration that originally created those phenomena, then every haunted location becomes a potential breeding ground for new tragedies that perpetuate cycles of violence and madness across generations. But our journey through America's most haunted lighthouses continues, and our next destination will challenge your understanding of childhood innocence and the terrible things that can happen when young lives are cut short by preventable tragedies that create supernatural consequences lasting far beyond the original deaths. December 1943. World War II is raging across two oceans, and America's coastline bristles with watchtowers and searchlights. Coast Guard spotters stationed along Fire Island's frozen dunes are scanning the Atlantic for German U-boats when they see something that makes their blood turn to ice water. Three small figures are dancing in the moonlight on the snow-covered beach below the lighthouse, dancing and laughing in temperatures that would kill a grown man in minutes. The spotters rub their eyes, certain they're hallucinating from the cold. But when they look again through their binoculars, the children are still there, spinning in circles around the base of the towering white beacon, leaving tiny footprints that spiral closer and closer to the lighthouse door. By morning, those footprints would be gone. The children would be gone. But the nightmare was just beginning. Let me take you back to where this horror story really starts. Fire Island Lighthouse had been guiding ships safely through treacherous waters since 1858. Its black and white striped tower standing like a guardian angel over the barrier island. The lighthouse keeper in 1943 was a man named Samuel Morrison, a weathered soul who'd taken the job to escape the chaos of the war-torn world. He brought his family with him, his wife Martha, and their three children, 10-year-old Timothy, 8-year-old Sarah, and little 6-year-old Michael, who still believed in magic and monsters under the bed. Samuel thought Fire Island would be the perfect place to raise his children. Isolated, peaceful, safe from the bombs falling on London and the submarines prowling just miles offshore. The irony would haunt him for the rest of his very short life. It was November 15, 1943, when the blizzard hit. Not just any blizzard. One of those once-in-a-century storms that meteorologists would later describe as a perfect convergence of Arctic air masses and coastal moisture. The wind howled at 90 miles per hour. Snow fell so thick you couldn't see your own hand stretched out in front of your face. The lighthouse beacon was the only thing visible for miles, cutting through the white wall of death like a sword of light. Samuel was in the lamp room, manually rotating the lens because the electric motor had failed, when he heard Martha screaming from below. He raced down the spiral stairs, taking them 3 at a time, his heart hammering against his ribs. Martha was standing in the kitchen, her face white as the snow outside, pointing at the back door. It was standing wide open, banging against the wall in the hurricane-force wind. The children were gone. Samuel and Martha searched for hours. They screamed the children's names until their voices gave out. They followed tiny boot prints in the snow, but the trail seemed to go in circles around and around the lighthouse base, getting smaller and smaller, until finally there were no more prints at all. Just smooth, undisturbed snow stretching to the frozen shoreline. When the storm finally passed 2 days later, search teams arrived from the mainland. They found something that made even the most hardened rescuers question their sanity. Hundreds of small mitten prints pressed into the ice, forming perfect spirals around the lighthouse. Some of the prints were 20 feet up the side of the tower, as if the children had been climbing the sheer stone walls like spiders. Samuel Morrison was found 3 days after that, hanging from the lamp room ceiling. His suicide note contained only 7 words. "They keep calling me to come play." The military immediately declared Fire Island a restricted zone. Officially, it was for coastal defense purposes. Unofficially, the Coast Guard had received reports of strange lights, phantom voices, and equipment malfunctions that couldn't be explained. The lighthouse was automated and sealed, but sealing a building doesn't keep the dead inside. The first documented encounter happened in 1958, when a maintenance crew arrived to service the automated beacon. The head electrician, a no-nonsense man named Frank Kowalski, was working alone in the lamp room when he heard footsteps on the spiral stairs below. Slow, deliberate footsteps climbing toward him. Child-sized footsteps. Frank called out, thinking maybe some local kids had broken in. The footsteps stopped, then started again, faster this time, racing up the iron stairs like children playing tag. Frank grabbed his flashlight and headed for the stairwell. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing, empty stairs, but he could still hear the footsteps, now coming from above him, coming from the room he'd just left. He spun around and saw 3 small handprints pressed against the inside of the lamp room window. Fresh handprints, still fogging the glass with condensation. As Frank watched in horror, more prints appeared. Dozens of them, as if invisible children were pressing their faces and hands against every window in the tower. Frank ran. He left his tools, left his truck, and ran across the frozen dunes until he reached the Coast Guard station. He quit his job that same day and never spoke about what he'd seen for the rest of his life. But the children weren't finished playing. In 1962, a group of bird researchers were granted permission to stay overnight in the lighthouse keeper's quarters. They were studying winter migration patterns, and Fire Island's position made it perfect for tracking birds crossing the Atlantic. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell and her 2 graduate assistants set up their equipment just as the sun was setting behind the lighthouse tower. Nothing screams family vacation like spectral hide-and-seek in sub-zero wind chill, right? Sorry, I know this isn't funny, but sometimes you need a moment to breathe when you're diving this deep into darkness. Because what happened to Dr. Hartwell's team that night would change paranormal research forever. They were awakened at 2:17 a.m. by the sound of children giggling. Not threatening laughter, not evil cackling. Just happy children playing games. Dr. Hartwell found a chalkboard in the kitchen with a game of tic-tac-toe drawn on it. 3 X's in a row. A child's victory. She erased the board and went back to bed. When she woke up, there was a new game. 3 O's in a row. Someone had been playing against the first child. Dr. Hartwell hadn't heard anyone enter the kitchen. The next night, she stayed awake and watched the chalkboard. At exactly 2:17 a.m., she saw the chalk lift by itself and draw an X in the center square. Then nothing. Dr. Hartwell picked up the chalk and drew an O in the corner. Immediately, an invisible hand guided the chalk to block her move with another X. She was playing tic-tac-toe with a dead child. This went on for 20 minutes. The child always won. And at the end of each game, Dr. Hartwell could swear she heard a small voice whisper, "Thank you for playing with us." But the most terrifying incident happened in 1971, when a young couple broke into the lighthouse on a dare. Tommy Chun and his girlfriend Lisa were local high school seniors, and breaking into the haunted lighthouse was considered the ultimate test of courage among Fire Island teenagers. They brought sleeping bags and planned to spend the night in the keeper's quarters. What they didn't plan on was being locked inside. At midnight, they heard children's voices outside, calling for them to come play. The voices were sweet, innocent, pleading. "Come outside. Come play with us, we've been so lonely." Tommy and Lisa looked out the windows but saw nothing except snow-covered dunes in the moonlight. Then Lisa noticed something that made her blood freeze. Child-sized handprints were appearing in the frost on the outside of the windows. Fresh prints forming as they watched. And the children's voices were getting closer, coming from right outside the door now. "Please come outside. We just want to play. We've been waiting so long." Tommy tried to open the door to prove there was nothing there. The door wouldn't budge. The heavy wooden door that had opened easily when they'd broken in was now sealed tight, as if someone on the other side was holding it shut with superhuman strength. They were trapped, with whatever was outside getting more insistent. "Come out! Come out! Wherever you are!" The voices sang, like a twisted version of hide and seek. "We know you're in there. Why won't you play with us?" Tommy and Lisa huddled together in the center of the room as the voices circled the building. Sometimes the children sounded like they were on the ground. Sometimes they sounded like they were climbing the outside walls. Sometimes they sounded like they were on the roof, directly above the terrified teenagers. This went on until dawn. When the sun finally rose, the voices stopped. The door opened easily. Tommy and Lisa ran without looking back. But the most chilling evidence came in 2003, when a team from the Long Island Paranormal Research Society was granted permission to investigate the lighthouse. They brought thermal imaging cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, and digital voice recorders. What they captured that night has never been fully explained. The thermal cameras showed small heat signatures moving through the lighthouse, signatures that corresponded to the size and shape of children aged 6 to 10. The EMF detectors went crazy whenever these thermal signatures appeared, registering energy spikes that should have been impossible in the isolated lighthouse. But it was the digital recording that provided the most haunting evidence. As the team was preparing to leave at sunrise, they reviewed their audio files. Most of it was just ambient noise, wind through the tower, the creaking of old wood and metal. But at 2:17 a.m., the same time Dr. Hartwell had heard the voices 40 years earlier, there was something else. A child's voice, clear as crystal despite the decades of death that separated it from the living world. "We never made it home," the voice whispered. "Will you help us find our way? We've been playing here so long, but we want to go home now. Will you take us home?" The recording cuts off there. Not because the equipment failed, but because what happened next was too terrible to document. The research team fled the lighthouse and never returned. They sealed their files and refused to discuss what they'd experienced. Fire Island Lighthouse still operates today, its automated beacon faithfully guiding ships through the treacherous waters off New York's coast. But Coast Guard maintenance crews refuse to work there alone. They always go in pairs, and they never stay after sunset. Because on Fire Island, bedtime stories never end. The children are still playing their eternal game of hide and seek, still leaving handprints in the frost, still calling for someone to join them in their dance around the lighthouse tower. And sometimes, on the coldest winter nights, you can still see 3 small figures spinning in the moonlight, their laughter carried on the wind like the echo of innocence lost forever. But our journey into maritime horror is far from over. 3,000 miles away, on the fog-shrouded coast of Oregon, another lighthouse keeper learned that some duties extend far beyond death. The Pacific fog horn wails like a banshee across the Oregon coast, its mournful cry cutting through the thick gray mist that rolls in from the ocean every evening at sunset. It's a sound that would make anyone's skin crawl, but for the night housekeeper at Heceta Head Lighthouse, that foghorn was nothing compared to what she saw standing at the top of the narrow wooden stairs. A woman in a gray Victorian dress was smoothing already perfect bedsheets with hands that moved like smoke. Her silver hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and she hummed a lullaby that no living person had heard for over a century. The housekeeper blinked, certain she was seeing things. When she looked again, the woman was gone. But the scent of lavender soap hung heavy in the air, and the bedsheets were now folded with military precision. Welcome to Heceta Head Lighthouse, where a mother's love has become a mother's curse, and housekeeping duties extend far beyond the grave. This story begins in 1894, when Thomas and Rue Simmons were appointed as keepers of the newly constructed Heceta Head Light Station. The lighthouse perched on a cliff 205 feet above the Pacific Ocean, its powerful beacon visible for 21 miles in clear weather. It was considered one of the most important navigational aids on the West Coast, and Thomas took his responsibilities seriously. Rue Simmons was a different kind of lighthouse keeper's wife. While most women in her position resigned themselves to isolation and loneliness, Rue threw herself into making their clifftop home a place of warmth and hospitality. She kept immaculate quarters, grew vegetables in the salt-sprayed garden, and opened their home to shipwrecked sailors and stranded travelers. But Rue's greatest joy was her 4-year-old son, Danny, a blonde-haired little boy who loved to explore the tide pools below the lighthouse and help his father polish the enormous Fresnel lens. Danny was the light of Rue's life, the reason she could endure the howling Pacific storms and the months of gray, endless winter. On September 23, 1894, Rue and Danny were walking along the rocky shoreline below the lighthouse. Danny loved to collect colorful sea glass that washed up after storms, and this particular afternoon had brought in an unusually beautiful array of blue and green fragments. The tide was going out, exposing tidal pools full of starfish and sea anemones. Danny spotted something glittering in a pool near the water's edge and ran toward it, his small boots splashing through the shallow water. Rue followed, laughing at her son's excitement. Neither of them noticed the rogue wave building offshore. Rogue waves are the ocean's cruelest joke. They appear without warning, towering walls of water that can be 3 times larger than the surrounding waves. Scientists didn't even acknowledge their existence until the 1990s, but sailors have been telling stories about them for centuries. Stories about waves that come from nowhere and destroy everything in their path. The wave that hit Heceta Head that afternoon was 40 feet tall. Rue saw it coming and screamed Danny's name. She lunged toward her son, grabbing him just as the wave crashed over the rocks. The impact was like being hit by a freight train made of ice water. Rue felt her ribs crack, felt the breath driven from her lungs, felt Danny's small hands slip from her grasp as the wave dragged them both toward the deep water. She managed to grab onto a barnacle-covered rock, her fingers bleeding as she fought against the tremendous suction of the retreating wave. She could see Danny being pulled out to sea, his little arms reaching for her, his mouth open in a scream she couldn't hear over the roar of the water. Rue let go of the rock. Thomas found their bodies 3 days later, washed up in a cove 2 miles north of the lighthouse. Rue was still holding Danny in her arms, even in death refusing to let her son face the darkness alone. That should have been the end of the story. Thomas remarried a year later and continued as lighthouse keeper until 1906. The lighthouse itself was eventually automated and converted into a bed and breakfast. Life went on. But for Rue Simmons, death was just the beginning of her longest duty shift. The first reported sighting came in 1963, when the lighthouse was being renovated into guest accommodations. A construction worker named Mike Castillo was installing new electrical wiring in the upstairs bedrooms, when he saw a woman in an old-fashioned gray dress standing in the hallway. She was holding fresh linens and seemed to be inspecting the rooms with the critical eye of a professional housekeeper. Mike called out to her, thinking she was another worker or maybe the owner checking on the progress. The woman turned toward him, and Mike saw a face of terrible sadness. Her eyes were the color of storm clouds, and tears ran down her cheeks like rain. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then faded away like morning mist. Mike found the linens she'd been holding folded perfectly on the bed in the master bedroom. Linens that hadn't been there 5 minutes earlier. But Rue's presence became much more pronounced when the bed and breakfast opened for guests. She seemed particularly interested in male visitors, especially those traveling with children. Male guests would wake up to find their belongings moved around, their beds made with hospital corners they definitely hadn't done themselves, and the overwhelming scent of lavender soap filling their rooms. If mom says make your bed, maybe just do it. Sorry, but when you're dealing with a perfectionist ghost who's been practicing her housekeeping skills for over a century, a little humor helps keep the spine-chilling terror at bay. Because Rue's attention to detail goes far beyond normal ghostly activities. Take the case of Robert and Patricia Morrison, who booked the Lighthouse's master bedroom for their anniversary in 1987. Robert was a skeptical attorney from Portland who'd heard the ghost stories and dismissed them as marketing nonsense designed to attract tourists. He made jokes about spooky housekeeping and paranormal pillow mints right up until their first night. The Morrisons were awakened at 3 a.m. by the sound of glass breaking. Not just one piece of glass. Every drinking glass, every window pane, every picture frame in their room had simultaneously shattered. But only in their room. The other guest rooms were undisturbed. Robert stumbled to the light switch, crunching through broken glass in his bare feet. That's when he saw her. A woman in gray standing in the corner of the room, her hands clasped in front of her, her sad eyes fixed on something only she could see. She was translucent, like looking at someone through water, but her presence filled the room with an overwhelming sense of sorrow. Patricia whispered, "She's looking for someone." The woman in gray turned toward Patricia and nodded. Then she gestured toward the window that looked out over the ocean, the same window through which she had once watched her son play in the tide pools below. When the Morrisons looked out the window, they saw something that made their blood turn to ice. A small figure was standing on the rocks below, exactly where Danny Simmons had been swept away 93 years earlier. A little boy in old-fashioned clothes, reaching up toward the lighthouse as if asking to be rescued. But when they blinked, the figure was gone. The woman in gray remained a moment longer, tears streaming down her spectral cheeks. She mouthed one word, "Danny." Then she faded away, leaving behind only the scent of lavender and the sound of breaking glass. The B&B owners, Bill and Cheryl Anderson, have documented dozens of similar encounters over the years. Rue seems to be searching for her son, endlessly checking rooms and straightening linens, as if preparing for Danny's return. She's protective of children but seems disturbed by the presence of adult men, as if she blames them somehow for her inability to save her son. But the most intense activity occurs during renovation work. It's as if Rue sees any change to her domain as a personal threat. In 1995, contractors attempting to repair the lighthouse's exterior found their tools scattered every morning, no matter how carefully they'd secured them the night before. Hammers would be found in the ocean below. Nails would be pulled from freshly installed boards. Paint would be spilled across completed work. The contractor foreman, a tough former Marine named Jim Santos, decided to work through the night to catch whoever was sabotaging his crew. He positioned himself in the master bedroom with a clear view of the exterior work area. At 2 a.m., he watched in disbelief as his crew's tools began moving by themselves. A hammer rose into the air and began pounding nails out of the boards they'd installed that day. A paintbrush dipped itself in white paint and began covering over their work with perfect, methodical strokes. And standing in the center of it all was the woman in gray, directing the phantom renovation with the authority of someone who'd been maintaining this lighthouse for over a century. Jim called out to her, "Lady, we're just trying to fix up your place. Make it nice for visitors." The woman turned toward him, and for the first time in any recorded encounter, she spoke. Her voice was like wind through seagrass, barely audible but filled with infinite sadness. "He might come back," she whispered. "Everything must be perfect when he comes back." Jim Santos quit the job the next morning. His crew refused to return. The exterior renovation was eventually completed by contractors who worked only during daylight hours and never stayed overnight. But perhaps the most heartbreaking encounter occurred in 2003, when a family with a 4-year-old son stayed in the lighthouse. The little boy, coincidentally also named Danny, was the same age Rue's son had been when he drowned. Throughout their 3-day stay, the child insisted he had a gray lady friend who played with him and told him stories about the ocean. The boy's parents, initially charmed by their son's imagination, became concerned when they found him standing at the upstairs window at dawn, having conversations with someone they couldn't see. When they asked him about it, he said the gray lady was teaching him about tide safety and showing him where the dangerous waves come from. On their final morning, as the family was packing to leave, little Danny ran up to his parents with tears in his eyes. "The gray lady is very sad," he said. "She wants to know if I can stay and be her little boy, because her Danny got lost in the water and never came home." The family left within the hour. Heseda Head Lighthouse continues to operate as both a working navigational aid and a bed and breakfast. Guests can still book overnight stays, though the owners are always upfront about the lighthouse's supernatural resident. Most visitors find Rue's presence more melancholy than frightening. She seems to be a mother lost in time, forever performing the duties that once gave her life meaning while searching for the child she couldn't save. But as touching as her story might be, there's something deeply unsettling about a love so strong it transcends death. Because sometimes the greatest devotion can become the greatest curse, and maternal instincts don't always distinguish between protection and possession. The morning mist is beginning to roll in, and that foghorn is calling again. But our journey through haunted lighthouses is far from over. 2,000 miles inland, on the shores of a freshwater sea that swallows freighters whole, another keeper learned that some storms never end. The locals call them the gales of November, and if you've ever stood on the shores of Lake Superior during one of these legendary storms, you'll understand why grown men cross themselves and whisper prayers when they hear that wind picking up. 60-foot waves crash against the rocky coastline with the force of freight trains, turning the largest of the Great Lakes into a freshwater hurricane that can snap a 700-foot or carrier in half like a toothpick. It was during one of these November gales in 1924 that lighthouse keeper Sean O'Malley climbed the exterior catwalk of Split Rock Lighthouse for the last time. The last entry in his logbook, written in handwriting that grew increasingly erratic as the storm intensified, contained just 4 words that would haunt Lake Superior for the next century. "All is lost. God forgive me." When the storm finally passed 3 days later, O'Malley was gone. But his lantern room light continued to rotate, casting its beacon across waters that had already claimed 3 carriers and 29 souls during that terrible November storm. Split Rock Lighthouse perches on a 130-foot cliff overlooking Lake Superior, about 20 miles northeast of the port city of Two Harbors, Minnesota. Built in 1910 after a devastating storm sank multiple ships in a single night, the lighthouse was considered an engineering marvel. Its third-order Fresnel lens could be seen for 22 miles on a clear night, and its steam-powered fog signal could be heard for miles through the thick lake-effect fog that regularly blankets the North Shore. Sean O'Malley had been the lighthouse keeper since 1918. A former merchant marine who'd seen action in the Great War, O'Malley was known for his meticulous record-keeping and his almost supernatural ability to predict Lake Superior's moods. Local ship captains trusted his weather observations more than the official forecasts from Duluth, and many credited O'Malley's warnings with saving their lives during sudden squalls. But November 1924 brought a storm that defied all prediction. The weather had been unusually mild for late fall, with temperatures in the 50s and calm waters that looked more like late September than late November. Ships were taking advantage of the extended shipping season, pushing their luck with one more run before winter ice closed the lakes to navigation. O'Malley had been tracking a low-pressure system moving across Manitoba, but all the models suggested it would weaken as it crossed into Minnesota. Instead, the system exploded into a superstorm when it hit the warm waters of Lake Superior. Barometric pressure dropped so fast that fish were found dead from pressure changes. Winds went from 15 miles per hour to 80 miles per hour in less than 3 hours. O'Malley was alone in the lighthouse that night. His assistant keeper had taken leave to visit family in Duluth, and his wife was staying with their daughter in town, having given birth just 2 weeks earlier. As the storm intensified, O'Malley realized he was watching ships die, and there was nothing he could do but keep the light burning and pray they could see it through the horizontal snow and spray. The ore carrier Samuel Mather was the first to go down. O'Malley watched through his binoculars as the 544-foot ship fought massive waves just 3 miles offshore. At 9:47 p.m., his logbook records, Mather taking heavy seas over bow. She's riding too light. God help them. At 10:15 p.m., Mather's lights gone dark. Can see her hull rolling. She's broken apart. At 10:23 p.m., no survivors visible. All hands lost. The Lambton and the Altadoc followed within the next 2 hours. O'Malley's entries became increasingly frantic as he watched ship after ship struggle against waves that towered above their wheelhouses. His lighthouse beam was the only guide they had, the only hope of finding shelter in the lee of the cliff. But O'Malley's light wasn't powerful enough. The storm was too intense, the visibility too poor. One by one, he watched the ships disappear beneath the black water. His final logbook entry, made at 2:30 a.m. on November 29th, was barely legible. Can't save them. Light not strong enough. All is lost. God forgive me. Going to make the light brighter. Must climb outside. Must reach the lens. What happened next can only be pieced together from evidence found after the storm. O'Malley had apparently attempted to climb the exterior catwalk to the lantern room, possibly hoping to manually adjust the lens or clear ice that might have been blocking the light. It was an incredibly dangerous thing to attempt in calm weather, let alone during a hurricane-force storm. Searchers found his oilskin coat tangled on the catwalk railing, ripped to shreds by the wind. But Sean O'Malley was never found. The lake had claimed him as surely as it had claimed the crews of the 3 ore carriers. But here's where the story gets really strange. Throughout the remainder of that terrible storm, ships reported seeing Split Rock's light operating normally. The beam rotated on schedule, the fog signal sounded its regular pattern, and the light appeared bright and steady. Several ship captains later said that O'Malley's light was the only thing that allowed them to navigate to safety. The problem was, there was nobody alive in the lighthouse to operate the equipment. When the Coast Guard finally reached Split Rock after the storm, they found the lighthouse locked from the inside. The main light was operating normally, but there was no sign of O'Malley. The logbook lay open on his desk, the final entry still wet with ink despite being exposed to the storm for 3 days. The Coast Guard assumed the equipment was operating automatically, but Split Rock's light required manual operation. The lens had to be rotated by hand using a clockwork mechanism that needed to be wound every 4 hours. The fog signal required constant monitoring of the steam pressure. Without O'Malley, the light should have gone dark within hours of his disappearance. But it never did. The first documented supernatural encounter came in 1925, when O'Malley's replacement, David Hendricks, reported strange occurrences during storm watches. Equipment that should have failed without maintenance continued to operate perfectly. The lens rotated smoothly even when the clockwork mechanism hadn't been wound. And during the worst storms, Hendricks swore he could hear footsteps on the exterior catwalk, the same route O'Malley had taken on his final climb. In 1934, during another November gale, Hendricks was awakened by the sound of the fog signal operating, even though he'd shut it down earlier due to equipment problems. When he climbed to the lantern room to investigate, he found wet boot prints leading from the exterior door to the fog signal controls. The prints were filled with lake water and what looked like ice crystals, as if someone had just climbed up from the storm-tossed lake below. The boot prints matched O'Malley's size and pattern, based on impressions found in his quarters. Pro tip: when the lake nicknamed the Widowmaker starts leaving footprints, cancel your fishing trip. I know, gallows humor in the face of supernatural terror. But when you're dealing with ghost stories from the Great Lakes, sometimes laughter is the only thing standing between you and complete existential dread. Because Lake Superior doesn't just kill people, it preserves them in its icy depths, and sometimes they come back to finish their duties. The most compelling evidence of O'Malley's continued presence came during World War II, when Split Rock Lighthouse was briefly reactivated to guide or carriers transporting iron to steel mills for the war effort. Coast Guard personnel reported that during severe storms, the lighthouse equipment would operate without human intervention. Lenses would be cleaned overnight, mechanisms would be maintained, and the light would burn bright even during power outages. Petty Officer Robert Chen, stationed at Split Rock in 1943, documented several encounters with what he believed was O'Malley's ghost. Chen's official reports, preserved in Coast Guard archives, describe a figure in oilskin coat who would appear during the worst storms, always moving toward the lantern room, always climbing against the wind and waves. The figure appeared to be struggling against tremendous forces, Chen wrote. It moved with determination but seemed to be fighting every step. When lightning illuminated the catwalk, I could see through the figure as if it were made of mist, but its movements were purposeful and directed. It was attempting to reach the light apparatus. The most dramatic encounter occurred in 1975, when a severe November storm knocked out power to the automated lighthouse equipment. The light went dark for the first time since O'Malley's disappearance, leaving several ships without navigation aid in dangerous waters. Coast Guard maintenance crews couldn't reach the lighthouse due to the storm intensity, but ships in the area reported that Split Rock's light came back on at 3:30 a.m. and operated normally for the remainder of the storm. When crews finally reached the lighthouse after the weather cleared, they found the backup generator had been manually started and the light had been switched to emergency operation mode. Security footage from a camera installed in 1998 captured the most chilling evidence yet. During a severe storm in November 2003, the camera recorded a translucent figure moving through the lighthouse during a power outage. The figure appeared to be performing routine maintenance tasks, checking equipment and adjusting controls exactly as a lighthouse keeper would during a storm watch. But the most haunting aspect of the footage was that the figure cast no shadow and left no footprints. Yet the equipment it touched responded as if operated by physical hands. Lens assemblies rotated, switches turned, and gauges responded to the Phantom Keeper's ministrations. Split Rock Lighthouse was permanently decommissioned in 2019, its navigational duties transferred to GPS and automated systems. But during the decommissioning process, workers reported equipment operating on its own, particularly during rough weather. The lighthouse beam was seen rotating even after the electrical systems had been disconnected. On the final night before the lighthouse was officially shut down, The maintenance crew left a note in the logbook. "Thank you for your service, Keeper O'Malley. Your watch is ended." The next morning, they found a response written below their message in handwriting that matched O'Malley's logbook entries. "Watch never ends. Ships still need the light. Split Rock Lighthouse may be officially decommissioned, but local ship captains still report seeing its beam during severe storms." The Minnesota Historical Society has documented over 50 sightings since 2019, all during dangerous weather conditions when ships most need guidance. Sean O'Malley took his duties seriously in life, and apparently death hasn't relieved him of his responsibilities. He remains at his post, forever trying to make his light bright enough to save the ships he couldn't save on that terrible November night in 1924. The November gales continue to sweep across Lake Superior, and somewhere in the howling wind and crashing waves, you can still hear the sound of footsteps on a catwalk, still climbing against the storm, still reaching for a light that must never go dark. But our journey through haunted lighthouses carries us back to the ocean now, to the Connecticut coast where love turned to revenge, and a heartbroken handyman found that some repairs can never be completed. The luxury yacht Serendipity was making its evening approach to New London Harbor when Captain James Morrison noticed something odd about the lighthouse ahead. A man was standing on the gallery deck, waving frantically at the approaching vessel. Nothing unusual about that. Lighthouse keepers often acknowledged passing ships. But as Captain Morrison raised his binoculars for a better look, the figure suddenly threw himself over the railing, plummeting toward the dark water below. Morrison immediately radioed the Coast Guard and altered course toward the lighthouse, expecting to find a body in the water or a survivor clinging to the rocky foundation. His crew scanned the area with searchlights for over an hour. They found nothing. No body, no debris, no sign that anyone had fallen from the lighthouse. When they finally reached the Coast Guard station to file their report, Morrison learned something that made his blood run cold. New London Ledge Lighthouse had been automated since 1987. There hadn't been a keeper stationed there for over 30 years. But someone or something was still jumping from that lighthouse, night after night, in an endless repetition of heartbreak that began over 90 years ago. New London Ledge Lighthouse stands on a concrete pier about 3 miles southeast of New London Harbor, Connecticut. Built in 1909, it's unique among American lighthouses for its distinctive Second Empire architecture. It looks more like a French mansion that somehow ended up in the middle of Long Island Sound than a traditional lighthouse tower. The lighthouse was home to a succession of keepers who lived in remarkable isolation, maintaining the light and fog signal that guided ships through the treacherous waters where the Thames River meets the Sound. It was a lonely posting, made bearable only by the knowledge that their work saved lives and the occasional visit from supply boats or passing vessels. In 1928, a man named Ernest Clausen took the position as head lighthouse keeper. Ernie, as everyone called him, was a skilled handyman and mechanic who'd grown up working on boats in New London's shipyards. He was perfect for the job, capable of maintaining the complex lighthouse machinery, comfortable with solitude, and practical enough to handle the challenges of life on an isolated rock 3 miles from shore. Ernie had another reason for taking the lighthouse job. He was engaged to Mary Helen Morrison, a schoolteacher from New London, and the lighthouse keeper's salary would give them enough money to start their new life together. Helen had promised to wait for him, and they planned to marry as soon as Ernie had saved enough money to buy a house in town. For 2 years, everything went according to plan. Helen visited the lighthouse whenever weather permitted, bringing news from town and supplies for their future home. Ernie threw himself into his work, not just maintaining the lighthouse but improving it. He built custom furniture for their quarters, installed better insulation for the harsh Connecticut winters, and created a small workshop where he could pursue his hobby of boat building. But isolation does things to people. Helen's visits became less frequent as 1930 wore on. She complained about the long boat rides, the rough seas, the primitive living conditions at the lighthouse. When Ernie suggested she could move to the lighthouse after their wedding, Helen laughed and said she'd go crazy living on a rock in the middle of nowhere. The first crack in their relationship came in December 1930, when Helen missed their planned Christmas visit due to a terrible cold. Ernie waited for her boat for 3 days, watching the horizon through his binoculars, before finally accepting that she wasn't coming. When the supply boat arrived on December 28th, the captain mentioned seeing Helen at a New Year's dance in town, looking perfectly healthy and dancing with the ferry captain, Robert Kane. Ernie convinced himself it was just gossip. Helen was friendly and social, of course she'd dance with other men at public events. But doubt had been planted, and isolation gave it room to grow. Throughout the winter of 1931, Helen's letters became shorter and less frequent. She canceled visits due to weather, work obligations, or family commitments. When she did visit, she seemed distant and distracted, spending more time looking toward shore than talking with Ernie about their future. The truth came out on May 15, 1931, when the supply boat brought devastating news along with Ernie's monthly provisions. Helen had married Robert Kane in a small ceremony the previous weekend. She'd sent a letter explaining her decision, but the supply boat captain, Tom Bradley, had the unfortunate duty of delivering the news in person. She said to tell you she's sorry, Bradley later told investigators. Said lighthouse life wasn't for her, and she'd found someone who could give her the life she wanted in town. Ernie just stood there like he'd been shot. Didn't say a word, just took the letter and walked back inside. Bradley was the last person to see Ernest Clausen alive. The lighthouse continued to operate normally for 3 more days. Ships reported the light functioning properly, the fog signal sounding on schedule. But on May 18th, a fishing boat captain named Michael Santos noticed something odd about the lighthouse. The light was on, but it wasn't rotating. It was stuck pointing in one direction, toward New London Harbor, toward the town where Helen was beginning her new life with another man. The Coast Guard investigation found Ernie's body 3 days later, washed up on Fisher's Island. The cause of death was drowning, and the evidence suggested he'd jumped from the lighthouse gallery during the early morning hours of May 19th. His suicide note, found on his workshop table, contained just one line: "Can't fix a broken heart." The lighthouse was automated within a month of Ernie's death, but the automation never worked quite right. The rotating mechanism would jam at regular intervals, always stopping when the light pointed toward New London. Maintenance crews would fix it, and within days it would jam again in the exact same position. More disturbing were the reports from ships passing the lighthouse at night. Captains began reporting sightings of a man on the lighthouse gallery, usually around 3 a.m. The figure would wave at passing vessels, then suddenly disappear. Sometimes crew members would see the figure climb over the gallery railing and fall toward the water, only to reappear moments later waving from the same spot. Bad breakup? At least you didn't rear out shipping lanes out of spite. I know that's a terrible thing to joke about, considering we're talking about a man driven to suicide by heartbreak. But sometimes dark humor is the only way to process the tragedy of a love so deep it transcends death and becomes something darker. Because Ernie's story doesn't end with his death, it gets much stranger and more disturbing. In 1945, the Coast Guard decided to station a small maintenance crew at the lighthouse to address the ongoing mechanical problems. Petty Officer David Wong and Seaman First Class Anthony Rivera were assigned to spend 2 weeks troubleshooting the lighthouse equipment and performing necessary repairs. On their first night, Wong and Rivera were awakened by the sound of someone working in the basement workshop. Hammering, sawing, the distinctive sound of a craftsman at work. Wong assumed Rivera was having trouble sleeping and had decided to organize their tools. Rivera assumed the same about Wong. When they met for breakfast the next morning, both men realized neither of them had been in the workshop. They went downstairs to investigate and found a half-completed boat taking shape on the workbench. A beautiful rowing dory, built with the kind of craftsmanship that takes years to master. The wood shavings were still fresh, the glue still wet on the joints. But that wasn't the strangest part. The boat was being built using materials that hadn't been in the workshop the night before. 100-year-old cedar planks, brass fittings that hadn't been manufactured since the 1920s, and tools that belonged in a maritime museum. Wong and Rivera searched the lighthouse from top to bottom. There was no other person on the structure, no boat that could have delivered the materials, no explanation for what they'd found. But every night for the next 2 weeks, they heard the sounds of construction from the workshop. Every morning, they found more progress on the mysterious boat. On their final night at the lighthouse, the sounds from the workshop were different. Instead of construction, they heard the sound of something being torn apart. Splintering wood, the screech of nails being pried loose, the crash of tools hitting the floor. In the morning, the workshop was empty. The boat, the antique materials, even the modern tools they'd brought from shore, everything was gone. The only thing remaining was a message carved into the wooden workbench. "She'll never sail away from me again." But Ernie's supernatural presence wasn't limited to woodworking. Ships passing the lighthouse began reporting more serious incidents. In 1952, the cargo vessel Atlantic Progress was approaching New London Harbor when its compass began spinning wildly. The ship's autopilot disengaged, and the helm felt like it was fighting against invisible hands trying to steer the vessel toward the lighthouse. Captain Eduardo Santos managed to regain control, but not before his ship came within 50 yards of the lighthouse foundation. As they passed by, every member of his crew saw the same thing. A man in lighthouse keeper's clothing standing on the gallery, beckoning for them to come closer. Similar incidents occurred with disturbing regularity throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Ships would experience compass malfunctions, autopilot failures, and steering problems when passing New London Ledge Lighthouse. The Coast Guard investigated repeatedly but could find no electromagnetic or mechanical explanation for the phenomena. The incidents seemed to target specific types of vessels: passenger ferries, pleasure craft, anything that might be carrying couples or families. Single-person sailboats and commercial fishing vessels rarely experienced problems. It was as if Ernie was trying to prevent other people from finding the happiness that had been denied to him. The most dramatic incident occurred in 1978, when the pleasure craft Second Chance was carrying Robert and Patricia Kane Helen's son and daughter-in-law back to New London after a weekend on Block Island. As they approached the lighthouse, their engine died without warning. Their radio went silent, their compass spun uselessly, and their charts were scattered by a sudden wind that affected no other vessels in the area. For 6 hours, the Kanes drifted helplessly near the lighthouse while Coast Guard rescue boats searched for them just miles away. Every attempt to restart their engine failed. Their emergency flares misfired or fizzled out before anyone could see them. It was as if they were trapped in a pocket of supernatural interference centered on the lighthouse. As the sun set, Patricia Kane saw a figure standing on the lighthouse gallery. A man in work clothes watching their boat with obvious malice. When she pointed him out to her husband, Robert Kane's face went white. He recognized the description from stories his mother had told him, stories about the lighthouse keeper she'd left for his father 50 years earlier. "That's Ernest Clausen," Robert whispered. "He's been waiting for us." The Kanes were finally rescued the next morning when a Coast Guard helicopter spotted them drifting near the lighthouse. Their boat's engines started immediately once they were outside the lighthouse's apparent zone of influence. Coast Guard investigators could find nothing wrong with their equipment. But the most chilling evidence of Ernie's continued presence came in 2019, when the Coast Guard installed new security cameras at the lighthouse as part of a modernization project. The digital cameras were designed to monitor the structure for vandalism and to provide real-time weather data to the National Weather Service. What they captured instead was the most comprehensive documentation of supernatural activity ever recorded at an American lighthouse. The cameras showed a figure moving through the lighthouse during storms, performing maintenance tasks with obsessive precision. Tools would move by themselves, repairs would be completed overnight, and equipment would function perfectly despite being decades old and officially out of service. But the most disturbing footage showed the figure's nightly ritual. Every night at exactly 3:17 a.m., the cameras recorded a translucent figure climbing to the lighthouse gallery. The figure would stand at the railing for exactly 13 minutes, looking toward New London Harbor. Then it would climb over the railing and fall toward the water below, only to reappear moments later at the gallery door, beginning the cycle again. Coast Guard technicians reviewing the footage noticed something else. The figure's appearance changed depending on the weather. During calm nights, it appeared sad and lonely. During storms, it looked angry and vengeful. And during nights when pleasure boats were anchored nearby, it seemed to watch them with predatory intensity. New London Ledge Lighthouse continues to operate as an automated navigational aid, its light faithfully guiding ships through Long Island Sound. But experienced mariners know to give the lighthouse a wide berth, especially during rough weather or when traveling with loved ones. Because some hearts never heal, and some handymen never finish their final repair. Ernest Clausen remains at his post, forever trying to fix what can't be mended, forever jumping from the lighthouse that became both his home and his tomb. The tools still move by themselves in the workshop below. The light still jams when pointing toward New London Harbor. And every night at 3:17 a.m., you can still see a figure standing on the gallery, looking toward shore with eyes full of heartbreak and rage. But our final lighthouse stands where the ocean herself keeps score, where centuries of shipwrecks have created a supernatural storm that makes all our previous stories seem like gentle whispers compared to the howling rage of the graveyard of the Atlantic. The black and white spiral tower rises 208 feet above the outer banks of North Carolina, its distinctive candy cane stripes visible for miles across the treacherous waters known as the graveyard of the Atlantic. Tonight, Hurricane Isaias is bearing down on the coast with 120-mile-per-hour winds and a storm surge that will rewrite the coastline. The lighthouse beam should be dark. The automated systems shut down hours ago as a safety precaution. But something is moving in the lantern room at the top of the tower. A pale light flickers where no light should be, and if you listen carefully over the howling wind, you can hear something that will freeze your blood. A woman's voice, singing a Victorian lullaby in perfect harmony with the hurricane's roar. This is the voice of Lenora Blackwood, and she's calling ships to their doom just as she has for over 150 years. Cape Hatteras has been claiming ships since European explorers first rounded its treacherous shoals in the 16th century. The meeting point of two major ocean currents creates constantly shifting sandbars that extend up to 12 miles offshore. These underwater mountains of sand, invisible beneath the surface, have torn the hulls from over 3,000 ships throughout recorded history. The waters are so dangerous that Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, first built in 1803, has been rebuilt twice to increase its range and power. The current tower, completed in 1870, was designed to be the tallest lighthouse in America, its first-order Fresnel lens visible for 24 miles on a clear night. But some wrecks aren't caused by shifting sands or hidden shoals. Some ships are lured to their destruction by lights that shouldn't exist, voices that shouldn't sing, and a woman whose greed in life created an appetite for destruction that death only amplified. Lenora Blackwood arrived in Cape Hatteras in 1863, during the darkest days of the Civil War. She claimed to be a widow from Charleston, her husband supposedly killed at Gettysburg, but the locals never quite believed her story. There was something too calculating about her grief, too practiced about her Southern belle charm. She rented a small cottage near the lighthouse and quickly established herself as a provider of comfort and supplies to shipwreck survivors. But Lenora's definition of comfort came with a price that went far beyond money. The Civil War had turned Cape Hatteras into a strategic battleground. Union blockade ships patrolled the coast, trying to prevent Confederate vessels from reaching southern ports. Confederate blockade runners used their knowledge of local waters to slip past the Union patrols under cover of darkness, often guided by sympathetic locals who would signal safe passage with lanterns. Lenora Blackwood saw opportunity in the chaos of war. She began offering her services as a pilot light operator, claiming her late husband had taught her the local waters before his death. For a substantial fee, she would position lanterns along the shore to guide blockade runners through the treacherous shoals. Confederate captains, desperate to deliver their cargo and willing to pay any price for safe passage, trusted her local expertise. What they didn't know was that Lenora was guiding them straight onto the sandbars. Her method was diabolically simple. She would study the tide charts and weather patterns, then position her lanterns to lure ships toward areas where the bars were shallowest during low tide. The ships would run aground in what appeared to be safe water, their hulls cracking open on the hidden sand. In the confusion and panic that followed, Lenora and her small crew of accomplices would row out to rescue the survivors. But rescue came with conditions. Everything of value on the wrecked ship's cargo, personal belongings, even the gold teeth of the dead, belonged to Lenora as payment for her life-saving services. Survivors who objected to these terms often didn't make it back to shore alive. For 2 years, Lenora operated her wrecking scheme with impunity. At least 17 ships fell victim to her false lights, their crews either drowned or murdered for cargo that filled Lenora's cottage with Confederate gold, Union silver, and contraband goods from around the world. She became one of the wealthiest women on the Outer Banks, her success attributed to her skill at salvaging from natural wrecks. But greed has a way of making people careless, and Lenora's appetite for destruction was growing stronger with each successful lure. On October 23, 1865, the Confederate blockade runner Seabird was making what would be one of the last runs of the war. Captain William Morrison had managed to slip past Union patrols and was approaching Cape Hatteras with a cargo hold full of medical supplies desperately needed by Confederate hospitals. Morrison was an experienced captain who knew the Outer Banks waters, but he was also exhausted from months of dodging Union warships. When he saw Lenora's carefully positioned lanterns spelling out the traditional safe passage signal, he gratefully adjusted course to follow her lights. The Seabird struck Diamond Shoals at full speed, her wooden hull splitting open like an egg. 23 crew members were thrown into the churning water, some killed instantly by the impact, others drowning in the confusion that followed. But Captain Morrison survived the wreck and made it to shore, where he confronted Lenora as she was looting his ship's strongbox. Morrison had lost his entire crew, his ship, and a cargo that could have saved hundreds of lives in Confederate field hospitals. When he realized what Lenora had done not just to his ship, but to the 17 vessels before it, his grief turned to murderous rage. The confrontation was witnessed by several locals who had come to help with rescue efforts. Morrison accused Lenora of deliberately wrecking his ship and murdering his crew. Lenora laughed and said the captain should be grateful she'd saved his worthless life. When Morrison lunged for her, Lenora pulled a pistol and shot him through the heart. That murder was one too many for the local community. Word spread quickly through the villages of the Outer Banks that Lenora Blackwood was not a helpful salvager but a cold-blooded wrecker who had been murdering sailors for Confederate gold. By sunrise, an angry mob had gathered outside her cottage. They found evidence that horrified even hardened watermen who had seen decades of shipwrecks. Lenora's cottage was filled with personal belongings from dozens of ships. Wedding rings, pocket watches, family photographs, children's toys, the intimate possessions of people who had trusted her lights and died for that trust. In her bedroom, they found a journal detailing every wreck she had caused, every life she had taken, written in handwriting that grew more erratic and bloodthirsty with each entry. The final entry, dated the morning of her arrest, contained a promise that would haunt Cape Hatteras for centuries. They think they can stop me, but the sea never gives up her dead. I will light ships to their doom until the last wave crashes on the last shore. The graveyard will never be full enough. The local magistrate declared Lenora guilty of piracy, murder, and treason. Under maritime law, the sentence was death by hanging. But the community had suffered too much at her hands for formal justice. On October 31st, 1865, Lenora Blackwood was dragged from her cell by masked men and hanged from the crossbeam of a makeshift gallows erected in sight of Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. Her final words, shouted over the jeers of the crowd, were a curse that echoed across the water. "I'll light every ship to hell before I rest. The Atlantic will run red with blood, and every soul lost will sing my lullaby." Lenora's body was thrown into an unmarked grave in the dunes behind the lighthouse. The townspeople burned her cottage and scattered her ill-gotten treasure back into the ocean, hoping to cleanse their community of her evil influence. But the dead don't always stay buried in the sand, and some curses are stronger than rope and earth. The first sighting came just 2 months after Lenora's execution. The supply schooner Mary Catherine was approaching Cape Hatteras on a calm January evening when her captain, Thomas Bradley, noticed something impossible. A woman in a white dress was standing in the lighthouse lantern room, 208 feet above the ground, holding a lantern that cast a pale blue light across the water. Bradley knew the lighthouse keeper personally, and he knew no woman lived in the tower. More disturbing, the official lighthouse beacon was dark. The lens had been damaged in a recent storm and hadn't been repaired yet. But the woman's lantern was clearly visible, swaying back and forth in a deliberate pattern that looked like a signal. Bradley was an experienced captain who knew better than to follow unauthorized lights near Cape Hatteras. He maintained his course and safely reached Hatteras Village. When he reported what he'd seen, the lighthouse keeper confirmed that no one had been in the tower that night, and certainly no woman in white. But other ships were not so lucky or so wise. Throughout 1866, vessels began reporting strange lights near Cape Hatteras that didn't match the official lighthouse pattern. Ships that followed these phantom lights often ran aground on Diamond Shoals or Wimble Shoals, sometimes in weather conditions that should have made wrecking impossible. Survivors spoke of hearing a woman's voice singing over the wind, calling them to follow her light to safety. The voice was described as hauntingly beautiful, like a lullaby sung by a loving mother. Sailors who heard it said they felt compelled to obey, as if the voice contained some hypnotic power that overrode their professional judgment and survival instincts. Ever blamed bad cell service on a 19th century pirate wannabe? Welcome to Hatteras. I know, making jokes about a supernatural mass murderer seems inappropriate. But when you're dealing with a ghost who has spent 160 years perfecting the art of maritime homicide, sometimes humor is the only thing standing between sanity and the abyss. Because Lenora's story doesn't get better, it gets exponentially worse. By 1870, when the current Cape Hatteras Lighthouse was completed, Lenora's phantom lights had been linked to over 30 shipwrecks. The new lighthouse, with its powerful first-order lens, was specifically designed to outshine any false lights that might lure ships to destruction. The lighthouse board believed that a beacon bright enough to be seen 24 miles away would eliminate the confusion caused by unauthorized lanterns. They were wrong. Lenora's lights seemed to grow stronger in response to the new lighthouse. Instead of a simple handheld lantern, witnesses began reporting an entire constellation of phantom lights moving along the shoreline. Balls of pale fire would dance across the dunes, sometimes spelling out messages in the sand, sometimes forming arrow patterns that pointed toward the deadliest shoals. But it was the voice that made Lenora truly dangerous. Ship's logs from the 1880s describe a phenomenon that sounds like something from a nightmare. Crews would hear a woman singing during heavy weather, her voice somehow audible over howling winds and crashing waves. The song was always the same, a Victorian lullaby about children playing by the sea. Rock-a-bye baby on the treetop, when the wind blows, the cradle will rock. When the bough breaks, the cradle will fall, and down will come baby, cradle and all. But Lenora's version had different lyrics, words that survivors would remember for the rest of their lives. Come to me, sailors, from over the foam. Follow my light and I'll guide you home. When the shoals catch you, your ship will break, and down to the bottom your souls I'll take. The psychological effect was devastating. Experienced sailors who had navigated treacherous waters for decades would abandon their professional judgment and follow Lenora's lights toward certain destruction. Ship captains would order course changes that made no sense, steering directly toward known hazards while their crews stood helplessly by, equally entranced by the supernatural lullaby. The worst incident occurred in 1893, when the passenger steamship Miranda, carrying 127 souls from New York to Charleston, encountered Lenora's lights during a severe nor'easter. Captain James Henderson was a 30-year veteran of coastal shipping, a man who knew every sandbar and current from Maine to Florida. But when Lenora's lights appeared through the storm, Captain Henderson ordered a course change that took the Miranda directly into Diamond Shoals. The ship struck the sandbar at full speed, her hull rupturing in multiple places. In the chaos that followed, passengers and crew heard a woman's voice over the storm, not offering comfort but laughing with maniacal glee. Of the 127 people aboard the Miranda, only 23 survived. The survivors all reported the same thing. As the ship was sinking, they saw a woman in white standing on the water, holding a lantern and singing her deadly lullaby while people drowned around her. The Miranda incident prompted a federal investigation into the phantom lights of Cape Hatteras. The Lighthouse Board sent a team of investigators to document the phenomena and determine if there was a scientific explanation for the false lights that seemed to appear during every major storm. What they found defied all attempts at rational explanation. The investigation team, led by maritime engineer Colonel Robert Santos, spent 3 months at Cape Hatteras during the winter of 1893 to 94. They brought the most advanced detection equipment available, including early electric lighting systems, precise surveying instruments, and cameras capable of photographing in low light conditions. On the night of February 14, 1894, during a severe winter gale, the team documented the most comprehensive supernatural encounter in maritime history. Their written report, preserved in the National Archives, describes events that challenge everything we think we know about the relationship between the living and the dead. At 11:47 p.m., the team's electromagnetic detection equipment registered massive energy spikes coming from the area around Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. The readings were so intense that several pieces of equipment overloaded and caught fire. At the same time, their cameras captured images of lights moving in impossible patterns across the landscape. But it was the audio recording that provided the most chilling evidence. Using an early phonograph system, the team recorded nearly 4 hours of supernatural activity. The recordings, which still exist in the Smithsonian's archives, capture Lenora's voice in crystal clarity as she sings her deadly lullaby and calls for ships to follow her lights. More disturbing, the recordings capture what sounds like responses, the voices of drowning sailors calling back to her, thanking her for guiding them home even as they realize she's led them to their deaths. The investigation team concluded that Lenora wasn't just luring ships to destruction. She was somehow collecting the souls of her victims and binding them to her eternal hunt. Colonel Santos' final report recommended that Cape Hatteras Lighthouse be abandoned and the entire area declared off-limits to shipping. His superiors rejected the recommendation as inconsistent with the rational operation of maritime commerce. But Santos' personal notes reveal his true feelings about what he'd witnessed. We have encountered something that exists beyond the boundaries of natural law. Lenora Blackwood is not merely a ghost. She is a supernatural predator who feeds on maritime disaster. Her power seems to grow with each ship she destroys, each life she claims. God help us all if she ever learns to extend her influence beyond Cape Hatteras. Santos' fears proved prophetic. Throughout the early 20th century, Lenora's phantom lights began appearing at other dangerous locations along the eastern seaboard. Shipwrecks with similar characteristics, false lights, phantom voices, survivors reporting supernatural encounters, occurred with increasing frequency near other lighthouses, always during severe storms, always with the same deadly results.